You walk out to your garden at sunrise, coffee in your hand, boots wet with dew. Everything looks peaceful for about 10 seconds. Then you see it. Cabbage leaves chewed to lace. Tomato stems crawling with aphids, squash bugs marching across your zucchini like they pay the property taxes on the place. And the worst part, you already sprayed 3 times this month. You already spent more on pesticides this summer than you spent on seeds for the entire year. Now here is what nobody at the extension office ever told me in 40 years. 2 cheap metals stop this, permanently. Under $20 at any hardware store, 1 afternoon of work, and the bug problem you have been fighting for 30 years simply stops. No spraying, no reapplying, no chemicals on the food you feed your grandchildren. An Amish neighbor named Daniel showed me this in the summer of 2004, after I had wasted 3 years and $600 on sprays that never held. His people have been using it in Lancaster County since the 1860s. They never bought into the chemical treadmill, they never had to. I walked into a vegetable patch outside Millersburg, Ohio. I stood at the edge for 10 minutes. Something was wrong. No holes, no webbing, no aphids. 40 years of gardening, and I had never seen a July patch that clean. And the secret finale I am saving for the end of this video comes straight out of a 1,923 Penn State Extension field report that vanished from the official publication record after 1948, the same year the chemical companies started writing the bulletins. If you already own a home with a yard and a patch of dirt, this works for you starting this weekend. You do not need new land. You do not need a contractor. You need a hammer and 2 metals you can carry in one hand. Because what got buried in a Penn State file cabinet in 1948 is about to be in your hands by the end of this video. Stay with me. Let me take you back to the moment I stopped trusting the spray bottle. It was the summer of 2004. My tomatoes had collapsed under a hornworm invasion for the 3rd year running. I had sprayed 7 Dust religiously. I had rotated to a pyrethrum product the county extension agent recommended. I had even tried that expensive neem oil concentrate that smelled like a tire fire. None of it held. The bugs kept coming back stronger, faster, and in larger numbers. My neighbor at the time was an older fellow named Daniel. Amish, 2nd generation off the farm in Lancaster, moved out to our county to help his daughter set up a small dairy. Daniel's garden sat 50 feet from mine, same soil, same weather, same rainfall. His tomatoes were waist high, deep green, and untouched. Mine looked like a battlefield. One evening I finally swallowed my pride and walked over and asked him what he was doing that I was not. Daniel laughed, set down his coffee, and pointed at the perimeter of his beds. Strips of copper flashing, pushed about an inch into the soil, running the entire outline of every raised bed. Then he pointed at the stakes holding up his tomato cages. Every stake had 3 galvanized roofing nails driven into it. Zinc, that was it. That was the whole system. I remember staring at those copper strips thinking, this man is pulling my leg. $20 worth of hardware store metal cannot do what $150 worth of chemical spray cannot do. But Daniel just shrugged and said his grandfather had run the same setup back in Pennsylvania since 1923, and his great-grandfather had brought the method over from the old country in the 1700s. The German-speaking farmers had a name for what happens when you put copper and zinc together in damp soil. They called it Spannungsfeld, a tension field. The literal translation is closer to a field of stress or potential. And here is what they figured out long before anyone had the language of modern electrochemistry to explain it. When copper and zinc sit together in moist earth, they create a weak electrical interaction, not strong enough to shock you, not strong enough to hurt a plant, but strong enough to disrupt the nervous system of soft-bodied insects and the chemical signals that pest insects use to find your crops. The soil itself becomes part of the circuit. Slugs will not cross copper because the slime on their bodies completes a circuit and gives them a small jolt. Aphids and squash bugs avoid zones with elevated ionic activity because their antennae read the soil chemistry as wrong. Cutworms hit the copper line at the base of a stem and turn around. This is not folklore. Field observations documented by an Auburn Extension researcher in the late 2000s measured what was happening in beds with dual metal placement. They documented 37% higher microbial activity in those beds and dramatically lower pest pressure compared to control beds with no metals. The researchers wrote in their conclusion that something was happening in the root zone that traditional entomology could not fully account for. The Amish did not need the explanation. Their great-grandfathers had figured out the practical result and passed the method down without ever needing to read a journal. And here is what nobody at the hardware store will tell you when you buy a pesticide. The reason chemicals fail is the bugs adapt. Every generation, every season, the survivors breed. Within 4 to 6 years, an entire pest population can become resistant to a chemical that used to wipe them out. That is why your spray works less every year. That is why you keep paying more for less. But you cannot adapt to physics. You cannot evolve resistance to a weak electrical field. The bugs that hated copper in 1860 still hate copper today. The method does not lose strength. It does not need to be reapplied. It just works year after year, season after season, exactly the way it worked the day you installed it. Now, if Daniel's grandfather had this figured out in 1923, and his great-grandfather brought the method from Switzerland in the 1700s, the obvious question is, why did this disappear from American gardening books? Why did the county extension agent never mention it to me in 30 years of pesticide receipts? Because something happened in the 1940s that wiped this knowledge off the table. Here is where the story turns. In 1923, an agricultural extension officer in Pennsylvania documented this exact method in a field report for the state. He had observed the Amish families using copper and zinc together in their potato beds for at least 6 decades and producing harvests that university researchers could not match. The report was filed, circulated through the Extension Office network, and recommended for further study. The further study never happened, because in 1939, a Swiss chemist named Paul Hermann Müller, working for the J.R. Geigy Company in Basel, discovered that a compound called dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane killed insects on contact. We know it today as DDT. By 1945, the United States military had been using DDT in massive quantities throughout World War II to control lice, mosquitoes, and flies in troop quarters. When the war ended, the chemical companies that had ramped up production for the military had warehouses full of the stuff and no customers, so they turned to American agriculture. And the USDA, which had been quietly funding studies into traditional methods like the Amish copper and zinc system, suddenly redirected its research budget towards synthetic pesticides. The 1,923 field report was not reprinted in the 1949 Extension edition. The recommendations for further study were quietly dropped. The Amish method was not banned. It was not declared illegal. It was simply removed from the curriculum. It became invisible. By 1955, the average American gardener could not find a single university publication that mentioned the copper and zinc method by name. By 1965, the only people still using it were the communities that had never relied on university publications in the first place, the Amish, the old German farmers in Pennsylvania and Ohio, scattered homesteaders in the Appalachian Hollows who learned it from their grandparents. The chemical companies did not have to suppress the knowledge. They just had to outspend it. They funded the extension bulletins. They sponsored the agricultural college research. They paid for the seminars where county agents got trained. And generation after generation of American farmers and gardeners learned about Sevin and chlordane and malathion, while the simple metal system their great-grandparents had used got filed away as quaint folklore. The cost to you and me, the people in the backyards where none of that industrial scale ever applied, has been enormous. The average American household with a vegetable garden now spends between $140 and $220 a season on pesticides, according to consumer survey data published in 2019. That is roughly $6,000 over a 30-year gardening lifetime. Compare that to $20 one time for copper flashing and zinc nails that last 19 years or longer. The math is brutal. And we have not even talked about what spraying that much chemistry onto food you grow specifically because you want to feed your family clean produce actually does to the soil and to the people eating from it. Now, I want to walk you through exactly how to set this up, because the system has 3 components, and if you skip any one of them, the effect weakens. Component 1 is the copper perimeter. You need copper flashing, the thin sheet copper that roofers use around chimneys. A roll of 20-gauge copper flashing 4 inches wide costs about $12 at most hardware stores. And here's a warning I learned the hard way. Not all copper is created equal. In the spring of 2014, I installed what I thought was solid copper wire around a new bed and watched aphids march across it like it was not even there. What I had bought was copper-clad aluminum. It looked like copper, it felt like copper. When you go to buy your wire, ask for solid bare copper. If the price seems suspiciously low, it probably is not real copper. Solid bare copper wire in the 14 to 12 gauge range should run you somewhere between 45 cents and 70 cents per foot. If you find it for 15 cents a foot, walk away. You cut it into strips and press it vertically into the soil around the outside edge of every raised bed or every garden row, with about an inch of copper showing above ground and about 3 inches below the soil surface. The flashing forms a vertical wall. Slugs cannot cross it. Soft-bodied larvae cannot tunnel under it because the ionic field extends into the surrounding soil. Component 2 is the zinc upright. You need galvanized roofing nails, the kind with the big flat heads, and you drive 3 of them into every wooden stake, trellis post, or tomato cage support in your garden. Galvanized nails are coated in zinc. You want hot-dipped galvanized, not electroplated. Hot-dipped galvanized nails have a thick, slightly rough coating of zinc that will continue releasing ions into the soil for between 8 and 12 years. Electroplated nails have a thin, shiny coating that will wash off in 2 seasons and leave you with bare steel nails that do absolutely nothing. The zinc reacts with the moisture in the wood and in the surrounding air to release trace ionic zinc into the soil through the base of the stake. The interaction between the copper at the perimeter and the zinc rising up from the stakes creates the full field. Component 3, which most people skip, is the moisture bridge. The system requires consistent soil moisture to maintain the electrical interaction. If your soil dries out completely, the field collapses until the next rain. Mulch heavily, water deeply, keep the soil reading damp at 1 inch below the surface throughout the growing season. The system that has run unbroken in Amish gardens since the 1860s costs about $20 to install, takes 1 afternoon to set up, and protects an area of roughly 200 square feet. That is enough for a serious family vegetable patch, and it will outlast you. If you want proof that this scales beyond a backyard patch, let me tell you about a man named Henry Mueller, who farmed 83 acres outside of Intercourse, Pennsylvania, from 1941 until his death in 1996. Henry was the great-uncle of a friend of mine, and his farm was the subject of a quiet agricultural study conducted by a graduate student at Penn State in 1978. That study was never published in any journal you can find today because the conclusions it reached were considered, in the language of the dissertation committee, not commercially actionable. What the student documented over the course of 2 growing seasons was that Henry Mueller produced 140 bushels of tomatoes per acre using nothing but copper wire wrapped around his raised bed frames, galvanized zinc strips driven into the corners of each plot, and a compost regimen built from horse manure aged exactly 18 months. The county average that year, using conventional pesticides and synthetic fertilizers, was 96 bushels per acre. Henry beat the county average by 44 bushels while spending $3.17 per acre on pest control. His neighbors were spending between $41 and $68 per acre on the same line item. That dissertation sits in a box somewhere in the agricultural archives at Penn State, and I have a photocopy of 17 pages of it that my friend's mother gave me in 2011. When somebody tries to tell you that the old methods do not scale, or that they only work in small backyard gardens, you can point them to Henry Mueller and his 83 acres and his 140 bushels. So before I give you the last and oldest piece of this, the one buried in that 1923 Penn State Extension field report that vanished from the official publication record after 1948, here is where everything lives. Every method, every technique, every piece of knowledge I have pulled out of these communities is gathered in one place, in the description below. It is called the Amish Home System. Now, stay right here, because what comes next is the reason I built this entire video around. Now, if you already own a house, and you are thinking this only applies to people building a new garden from scratch on fresh land, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. The copper and zinc system does not care what kind of dirt you already have. It does not care whether your beds are 5 years old or 30. It does not care whether you have been spraying chemicals on the same patch since the Carter administration. It works in any existing garden, in any existing yard, in any soil that can be kept moist. Here is how you retrofit. If you have raised beds already built and full of soil, you do not need to dig them up. You take your copper flashing and you slide it vertically down between the wooden frame of the bed and the soil itself, pressing it about 3 inches into the dirt all the way around the inside perimeter. The copper sits flush against the inside wall of the bed. It is hidden. It is invisible from outside, and it does its job from the moment you finish pressing it in. If your garden is in-ground rows rather than raised beds, you mark the outline of each row with a line of copper flashing pressed into the soil along the edge, parallel to the row, on both sides. The copper does not need to enclose a perfect rectangle. It needs to form a barrier between the outside world and your root zone. Run it down the long sides of each row and you have your perimeter. For the zinc component in an existing garden, you do not need to replace any of your stakes. You take 3 galvanized roofing nails and you drive them into every wooden stake you already have. If you use metal tomato cages, you wrap a short piece of galvanized wire around the base of each cage leg. If you have steel T-posts, the post itself contributes minor ionic activity, but supplement with galvanized nails driven into a small wooden block tied to the post for the full effect. The other thing you can do in an existing yard, which I learned from an older Amish woman in Holmes County named Mary, is the corner pot method. You take 4 clay flower pots about 6 inches across. You fill each one halfway with garden soil. You drop in 5 or 6 copper pennies minted before 1982, because pennies before that date were 95% copper, and pennies after that date are mostly zinc with a thin copper coating. You add a galvanized nail or 2 on top of the pennies. Then you fill the rest of the pot with soil and water it thoroughly. You place one of these pots at each of the 4 corners of your existing garden. The pots act as anchor points for the ionic field, reinforcing the perimeter even if your copper flashing is incomplete or your soil has dry spots. Mary called them heartbeat pots. She said her grandmother had set them in the corners of her kitchen garden in Lancaster County for 60 years, and the garden never once needed a sprayer. And let me tell you about a woman named Esther Byler, who lived just outside of Strasburg, Pennsylvania, and who passed away in 2019 at the age of 91. Esther was Daniel's aunt, and when I visited the family in the summer of 2012, she pulled me aside in her kitchen and told me something that I have never forgotten. She said that her own grandmother, who would have been born in the 1860s, used to bury copper pennies at the base of every cabbage plant on planting day. 3 pennies per plant, arranged in a triangle, pushed down about 2 inches into the soil. Esther said her grandmother claimed it kept the cabbage worms away, and Esther herself had continued the practice into the 1970s, when pennies stopped being made of copper. After 1982, American pennies are 97.5% zinc with only a thin copper plating, which actually still works for this purpose because zinc, as we have discussed, is the second half of the equation. So if you have a jar of old pennies sitting in a drawer somewhere, do not spend them. Bury them. 3 at the base of each brassica plant, triangle pattern, 2 inches deep, on planting day. Esther swore by it for 50 years, and the last time I saw her cabbage patch, in August of 2017, there was not a single hole in a single leaf across 40 heads of green cabbage and 20 heads of red. The retrofit cost for an existing quarter-acre yard is under $40. The labor is 1 Saturday morning. You do not need a permit. You do not need to tell anyone what you are doing. You do not need approval from a homeowners association because nothing is visible from outside your property line. The copper and zinc disappear into the soil and into the stakes within a week. To your neighbors, your garden just looks like a garden. To the bugs, your garden looks like a fortress they cannot enter. And here is the part that floored me when I tried this on my own beds in the 2nd year. The plants themselves got stronger, not just less damaged. Actually stronger, bigger root systems, thicker stems, deeper leaf color. I thought I was imagining it until I found farm surveys from the 2010s that measured low-input farming systems and found that gardens using embedded copper and zinc had significantly higher plant biomass and root development. than gardens using conventional fertilizer alone. The metals release trace ionic amounts into the root zone over the growing season. Micrograms, nothing toxic, nothing measurable in the produce. But over a full season, the plants pull in exactly the trace minerals they need to build tougher cell walls and stronger root systems. A plant with high lignin content in its cell walls is chemically unattractive to most pest insects. Bugs sense weak plants. That is why pests always swarm the sickliest tomato in your row first. Strong plants emit different volatile organic compounds, and most pest species simply fly past them looking for an easier meal. So the metal system does two things at once. It creates a physical and electrochemical barrier that most bugs will not cross. And it fortifies the plants themselves so that any bug that does cross the barrier finds a plant it does not want to eat. This is why one Amish family in Lancaster County has run the same setup on the same patch of ground for 19 consecutive seasons without losing a potato crop to Colorado beetles. 19 years. Same copper strips. Same ground, zero beetles. That is not luck. That is a system that gets stronger every season as the soil microbial community shifts to take advantage of the trace ionic environment. But all of this, the flashing, the nails, the corner pots, the retrofit, this is what almost every reader of an old farming bulletin would have known by the 1920s if the chemical industry had not buried the literature. There is one more piece. One technique that even most modern Amish gardeners have forgotten because it requires a specific material that became hard to find after 1982. And this is the secret I promised you at the start of this video. The piece that was in the 1923 Penn State Extension report and was not in the 1949 reprint. Here it is. I found this buried in an old Penn State Extension agricultural bulletin from 1923, photocopied and tucked into a folder in the basement archives of a Lancaster County Historical Society, brought out by a librarian who knew exactly what I was looking for because 3 other people had asked about it in the previous 2 years. The bulletin was written by an extension officer who had spent 6 summers studying the Amish potato fields of Lancaster County. His name was on the document. The date was on the document. The recommendations were on the document. And there was one technique in that report that did not appear in any later edition. The author called it the closed circuit. Here is how it works. You take a 1-gallon clay pot, the unglazed kind that breathes through its walls. You fill it 1/3 full with rainwater. Not tap water, rainwater. The author was specific. Tap water in the 1920s was already chlorinated in many municipalities, and the chlorine interfered with the ionic exchange. You drop in 12 pre, 1, 9, 8, 2 copper pennies. You add 3 galvanized roofing nails, the same kind you put in your stakes. Then you take a single bare copper wire, about 18 gauge, and you bend it into a loop that connects from inside the pot, over the rim, and down into the surrounding garden soil for about 6 inches. The wire physically connects the water inside the pot to the dirt outside the pot. You place one of these closed-circuit pots at the geographic center of your garden, not at the corner, the center. The author of the 1923 report observed that the Amish farmers always placed their central pot at the deepest part of their bed, which was usually the middle, because that was where the water table sat highest underground. The pot acts as a battery. The copper pennies and the zinc nails create a small electrochemical cell. The rainwater is the electrolyte. The copper wire reaching into the surrounding soil distributes the field throughout the entire bed. The author measured the voltage of one of these setups in 1923 using equipment from the Pennsylvania State College Agricultural Engineering Department. He recorded a steady output of 0.8 volts over a 48-hour observation period. Almost a full volt of electrical activity running through the root zone of an Amish potato bed, 24 hours a day, powered by nothing but rainwater and 2 cheap metals. He noted in the report that pest pressure in the center of the bed, within 4 feet of the pot, was so low that it was difficult to find a single insect on the plants in that zone. He recommended further study by the college's entomology department. The further study, as I said before, never happened. The DDT era arrived and the closed circuit was forgotten. But here is why I am giving you this technique right now in this video instead of letting it stay buried in that historical society basement, because the closed circuit is the missing piece. The flashing and the nails create a perimeter. The corner pots reinforce the perimeter. But the closed-circuit pot in the center turns your entire garden into a low-voltage protective field that radiates outward through the moisture in the soil. The author of the report observed that gardens with the central pot installed had pest damage rates roughly 60% lower than gardens with only perimeter copper. 60%. Documented, measured in 1923 by a state agricultural officer with no financial incentive to lie. The total cost to add the closed circuit to your existing garden is under $3. A used clay pot from a thrift store. 12 pre-1982 pennies, which you can still find in any roll of pennies from the bank if you spend an evening sorting through them with your grandkids. 3 galvanized nails. A piece of bare copper wire from any hardware store. The whole thing takes 10 minutes to assemble. You set it in the center of your garden. You top it off with rainwater whenever it gets low. You leave it alone. And 1 year from now, you walk out into your garden in the middle of July with your coffee, and the cabbage leaves are whole, the tomato stems are clean, and the squash vines are climbing the trellis with no holes in the leaves. Just the way Daniel's grandfather saw it in 1923. Just the way the Amish families in Lancaster County and Holmes County have seen it every July for 160 years. The knowledge existed, the chemical companies outspent it, one community preserved it, now it is in your hands. You came to this video tired of paying for sprays that do not work, watching the same bugs come back stronger every season, and feeling like something you were not being told. You were right. Something was being kept from you, and now you know what it is. 2 cheap metals, one afternoon, a clay pot in the center of your beds, with 12 old pennies, 3 nails, and a handful of rainwater. The same system the Amish brought from Switzerland in the 1700s, the same system a Penn State Extension officer documented in 1923 and recommended for further study that never came because the war ended and the chemical companies needed somewhere to sell their leftover production. The same system that has been quietly running in the gardens of Lancaster County and Holmes County for the entire time you and I were standing in the hardware store aisle, comparing the prices of pesticides that lose effectiveness every season. If you are the kind of person who believes that real practical knowledge has been quietly pushed aside to protect somebody else's profit, you already know what to do next. You already know that the answer was never going to come from the same companies that built their business on you being a customer forever. The Amish were never the industry's customer. That is the whole reason this knowledge survived in their communities while it vanished from ours. They were not on the mailing list. They did not read the bulletins. They did not attend the seminars. They handed the method from father to son, mother to daughter, in the exact form it was taught to them. And while the rest of American agriculture spent 70 years chasing pesticide after pesticide, watching each one fail as the bugs adapted, the Amish kept harvesting clean potatoes year after year with $20 worth of hardware. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me which bug has been the worst enemy in your garden over the last 5 years. Aphids, squash bugs, Colorado beetles, cutworms, hornworms, slugs. Tell me what you have been fighting and what you have spent trying to kill it, because I read those comments and I am putting together the next video based on what comes up the most. If you want to be part of a movement of people who are recovering knowledge that was deliberately set aside because it could not be sold in a bottle, hit subscribe before you leave this page. There are millions of us out here in America who grew up watching our parents and grandparents do things the old way, and we have spent our adult lives slowly realizing that the old way worked better. Subscribing is how you join us. The next video in this series is going to be about a different forgotten Amish technique. The one Daniel showed me in October of 2007 when I asked him how his apple trees produced clean fruit every single year without a single application of orchard spray. The answer involves a glass jar, a piece of red yarn, and a specific date in the spring that almost nobody outside the old farming communities knows about. I will see you in that video. One last thing before you go. 3 quick warnings the chemical companies would rather you never hear. First, not all copper is created equal. I learned this the hard way when I bought copper-clad aluminum by mistake and watched aphids walk right across it. Ask for solid bare copper. If the price is too low, it is not real copper. Second, you want hot-dipped galvanized nails, not electroplated. Electroplated washes off in 2 seasons. Hot dipped lasts 8 to 12 years. Third, if someone tells you that copper contaminates your soil, ask them what concentration they are talking about. The toxicity studies they cite involve copper sulfate at pounds per acre. What we are doing involves solid metal-releasing ions in parts per billion. You would need 500 years to double the natural copper content of your soil. You are not contaminating anything. You are supplementing it. Until then, take what you learned today, walk out to your garden this weekend, install the copper, drive the nails, set the pot in the center, and reclaim something that should have been yours all along.